Hey, as you welcome in, I'm welcoming you. I am Dr. Tara. Thank you for tuning in for Dr. Tara Tuesdays. We will get started in about a minute or so, giving people a chance to join us for the live. I'm so excited that people are here and coming on. This is going to be a wonderful discussion on the impact of childhood trauma. So we will wait just a few more seconds to give people a chance to come on. So, hey everyone, it is Dr. Tara. It is Dr. Tara Tuesdays. Thank you all so much for always tuning in with me. I am excited about the conversation this evening. I hope that it is helpful and impactful. We're going to be talking about the impact of childhood trauma. And before we get started, I always want to start with saying how important topics are to me, just professionally and personally. Some of you may know that over the past month, we have been highlighting dads and looking at dads and discipline, dads and depression, dads and co-parenting, and dads and grief and loss. And one of the common themes that came up for many of our guests, many of our phenomenal speakers was, the trauma that comes with being, we highlighted African-American dads, Black fathers, being fathers in America. And one of the things that, my training, just for those of you who don't know, is in trauma. I work with trauma survivors while I was getting my PhD and did therapy with them. So I have been trained to take a universal trauma-informed approach to everyone I meet, which means that every single person that I meet, in my view or my book, has survived something that they would consider to be traumatic. And so that influences the way that I speak to them, that influences my behaviors, that influences conversations. And so what I'm hopeful that today or tonight's conversation will do is just give people an understanding about the connection between childhood experiences and how we function as adults. I just posted on my page, I saw a meme that said, the real gateway drug is trauma. And I think that that is so true. And it's not talked about enough. Trauma is often left out of the conversation when we get into understanding people's personalities, people's behaviors, people's health. And so especially physical health, looking at how experiences that we went through as children before the age of 18 can literally impact our relationship with food, our relationship with nutrition, our relationship with exercise, our relationship with sleep. And so I'm going to jump into it, but I just wanted to give everyone a background. And also, if you are a therapist who is trained, who has received specialized training to work with survivors of trauma, please drop your name, drop your organization, drop your agency below. I'm going to be filling up the comments when this live is over with resources for people, organizations that I have worked with, organizations where I have trained therapists and working with survivors of trauma so that it can be helpful to those of you who want it. So we're going to jump into it. So peace, everyone. Again, thank you for joining me. When we think about childhood trauma, or when we think about the experiences that people have gone through that, get us to where we are as adults. One of the things that I want to introduce us to or talk about tonight a lot is something called ACEs, ACES, ACEs. And what that stands for is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So one of the things that I am a big believer in, and so this is the actual ACE study that came out, the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and adult health status. I want to give you all some background on that study. So ACEs, as it's known now, was published in 1998, 20 years ago, and it looked at 17,000 people, middle class, mostly white suburban Americans, who initially were participating in a weight loss study. And so this is the interesting thing, how we get to childhood trauma. So they were working with clients and getting them to lose ridiculous amounts of weight, like over 100 pounds, over 150 pounds. And one of the things that happened was people were regaining this weight and they could not account for it. They could not understand, these people are sticking to this diet regimen, understanding, how to eat, nutrition, and they couldn't understand why people were putting on weight and gaining it back. And so they interviewed this lady, and she talked about a gentleman giving her a compliment. And she said that when he gave her the compliment, it reminded her of her grandfather, who would give her a compliment before he would abuse her. And that then triggered what we now talk about as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. That then triggered a bigger study looking at literally 10 questions, three categories: abuse, your experiences of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. 3 categories, 10 questions, and then connecting that to whether or not you have adverse adult outcomes, looking at your ability to begin using drugs and alcohol, your propensity towards gaining weight, your likelihood of smoking cigarettes, your likelihood of having disruptions in neurobiological functioning. And so when we think about ACEs, one of the things that I want you all to take away is this pyramid. So this pyramid stands for adverse childhood experiences. And so when we think about experiences with trauma, one of the things that we're going to talk about is this, right? Adverse childhood experiences, what are they? So if I, before the age of 18, grew up in a household where someone was on drugs, where someone was incarcerated, where I had a parent with a mental health disorder, where I witnessed domestic violence, where my parents were divorced, where, I felt threatened, or I felt neglected, or I felt like I wasn't loved or being taken care of. One of the things that will happen to me is that I am more likely to experience what we call social emotional disruption, right? So there is this dope Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. Some of you, if you haven't watched her TED Talk, I'll put it in the comments. But she talks about her practice where so many children were being referred to her for ADHD. And one of the things that we know is that a lot of trauma behaviors look like ADHD. So one of the typical trauma behaviors for children ages 6 to 11 is hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor emotion regulation. And why is that? It's because trauma impacts that system 1 brain, right? So I'm going to use my handy dandy hand right now. So regardless of how fast technology works, we all develop brainstem up, bottom up, right? We develop spinal cord. This is my arm, spinal cord, something called our amygdala, prefrontal cortex, right? So our amygdala is housed in our brain. It's sometimes called our system 1 brain. It's responsible for those innate impulses, right? Those automatic responses. So when I feel cold, I give a signal. When I'm hungry, I give a signal. Our amygdala is housed in something called our limbic system. So our limbic system is responsible for our pleasure, right? It's our reward center. So, drugs of abuse, sex, chocolate, Idris Elba, all target our limbic system. And so what that means is that when I am experiencing or exposed to the stimuli, I will emit a signal, and that will send a connection, right? We have this beautiful brain-body connection. And so for children, it's very advanced because that's the only way they know how to communicate. So one of the reasons why we titled The Lie for Tonight, It Happened So Long Ago, is because that is such a common statement that's made, oh, it happened so long ago, you should be over it. Or why haven't you moved past it? And one of the things that we know is that, just like for those of you who may work out, you develop something called muscle memory. Your body does the same thing, right? Your body remembers events, whether they are healthy or unhealthy, in an attempt to help you survive. And so for children, this system, this neurological or physiological pathway is abundant, right? So I'm taking in all this stimuli. I'm a sponge. I'm taking in all this stimuli. And what happens when I've been exposed to trauma is that it targets this limbic system, this reward center, right? This part of my brain, most primitive, that's housed again under this prefrontal cortex, this part of my brain here. And so our amygdala is responsible for giving emotions to memory, meaning that for every memory that I have, there is an emotional component. Every single memory that I have, there's an emotional component. Meaning, for those of you who, think about relationships. I'm thinking about this time you made me happy. It leads me to think about another time you made me happy. Or I'm thinking about a time where you really irritated me. You got on my nerves. It's going to trigger me thinking about another memory, right? So the interesting thing about memories is that one memory triggers another memory. And so what happens, especially for children, is that this amygdala, even if I don't have verbal, abilities yet, even if I'm not able to talk about it, my brain is going to remember it because it's trying to keep me alive, and it's going to send signals to this prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain right here, right behind our forehead. And this prefrontal cortex is responsible for our abilities to make decisions, right? So I know what I should do. I have good emotion, and I know how to control my emotions. I know right from wrong. Well, a lot of times, and for those of you who are parents, for those of you who are mental health professionals, for those of you who have ever had a relationship with anyone, how many of us have ever thought the phrase, you know better, you know what you should be doing. Why are you doing that? And the interesting thing is that when this amygdala is, I see some thumbs up. Yes, we think that about people, right? And the interesting thing about this amygdala is that when it is threatened, when it is heightened, it sends all this confusion, all these mixed signals to this prefrontal cortex, right? So this prefrontal cortex is literally doing like this part of my brain. So how am I acting? I'm acting erratically. I'm if I'm a child, I'm having a situation where I'm throwing books across the room. I'm throwing chairs. And when we think about adults, how many of us have ever been in a situation with an adult or had a conversation with an adult, and we're saying something to them, and they're acting as if I said the worst thing ever. Well, all I asked you to do was pick up the trash, or all I asked you to do was do something else. What happens is that we have been triggered, and we're going back to those ages. So I'm going to draw. I have my handy dandy whiteboard out, guys. So some of you may remember this, but we all have this timeline from birth until now, right? And so at varying points in our life, let's say something happened at 4 and at the age of 15, at varying points in our life, we have different situations that happen. So let's say at the age of 4, I'm separated from my parent, and that brings up fear or panic or confusion, whatever happens. And that reunification isn't something that is helpful. So I don't know how many of you have ever lost a child in the store, but it brings up the same feelings for the parent. But that reunification isn't one where, rose petals are falling from the sky and we're running to each other in slow motion. That parent's fear usually turns into anger. And so think about it from a child perspective. If I'm feeling scared or if I'm feeling panic, the last thing that I need is to be met with anger. So what does that do to me from a social emotional standpoint, from that amygdala, again, that amygdala standpoint, most primitive part of our brain, causes a gap, right? And it causes a gap because what I need in this moment is not to be met with anger. And so, yes, Erica, yes, Yasmin. And so when we think about this part of our brain that gets disconnected, what happens is that it creates a memory for us, right? So that memory creates an emotion, meaning that when I do this, it triggers this in me, this brain-body connection. And so I may be 40 years old now, right? Now I'm in the now category. I'm 40 years old, and I know that I can't be separated from my parent the same way that I could when I was 4 because I have different skills, right? I know we both have a cell phone, or maybe, I know how to reach someone, or I know how to call someone. And so, but I'm in a situation that brings up these same feelings, right? That fear or that panic. You no longer have 40 or 50-year-old Tara talking to you. You have 4-year-old Tara talking to you. And why is that? It's because my brain is trying to close these gaps, right? My brain is trying to close these gaps. And so if we go back to this trauma triangle, bring it in, I have that social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, right? Because I want to feel a certain way. I want to do something differently. However, the brain can only close those gaps when I have skills, which is why when we think about the impact of adverse childhood trauma, it's easy for people to get themselves involved in the same situations over and over and over again because my brain is trying to close these gaps. So I'm constantly involved in relationships, whether it's romantic, whether it's platonic, whether it's friendship, whether it's family, where I put myself in certain positions, because the interesting thing about trauma is that while my environment has caused the trauma allows my brain to actually be restructured. And so I begin to actually seek out environments that are going to allow that trauma to continue, right? So I'm actually looking for people who fit the bill because I've normalized it. This is how I've been taught that people communicate their needs. This is how I've been taught to express emotion. This is how I've been taught to communicate my needs. This is how I've been taught, to share what I want or what I desire. This is how I've been taught to control my anger or not control it. I'm going to look for situations that will allow me to do that in order to get this need met. And so what happens is that this amygdala becomes flooded with, sensation. It becomes overstimulated, and we see these erratic behaviors. And so one of the things that we want to see when we're talking about, when we'll get into a little bit later, is how do we address that? How do we start to calm that? Because the amygdala then sends signals to this prefrontal cortex that allows me to behave a certain way. And this prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain, that is known for our ability to make good decisions. Thanks, Kathy. Ability to make good decisions, our ability to know right from wrong, isn't fully developed until about 25, 26. And so for all of this time period, I'm growing up thinking that this is how people communicate, right? Or I want this, and so I'm going to get my need met this way. Or I've tried, before, I remember being a child and I tried to say, I want this or I need this, and no one heard me or no one listened to me. Well, what does that do to me, right? What does that do to my identity as a person? What does that do to me being able to get my needs met? And how then do I learn to get my needs met when I'm an adult? I don't. I still use the same, again, I'm 40 years old, but I'm going back to these ages where this childhood trauma happened. And so what happens from that? So we have that disruption, right? That disruption between that social emotional piece, but that brain piece. And so what we see is that then makes me more likely to adopt what we call high risk health behaviors. And so what does that look like? So high risk health behaviors means that I'm eating. I feel a certain way, I'm eating, right? I feel sad. Our brains are chemically wired. One of the things that I've talked about before is looking at the impact of food, right? So many of us have learned to eat based on how we feel, not based on hunger. So, I'm chemically programmed. When I feel sad, and you can write your answer in the comment, when I feel sad, what is the thing that I want to have, right? Is it sugar or is it salt? When I'm sad, I want to eat sweets. I'm eating a whole gallon of ice cream. I'm eating something that is soft, bread. I'm craving those things. When I'm anxious, when I'm upset, what am I craving? I'm craving salt. I'm craving crunch. I'm craving, ice. I'm craving chips. I'm craving pretzels. I'm craving these things. I'm eating in a way that I'm just putting food in, just trying to calm myself down, which is why so many of us, when we are emotional eaters, I'll eat myself to a certain point, and then I just pass out. Then I just go to sleep. And so what happens then too, so that's one part, eating or nutrition, and then we get into drugs and alcohol. Well, what do drugs and alcohol do? They either make me feel or they make me not feel. And so one of the things that we understand too is that when we understand trauma, we understand that trauma has taken us outside of what we call our window of tolerance. And some of you may remember this because I talk about it all the time. So all of our emotions go on this bell curve. Every single emotion that we have goes on this bell curve, meaning that we all have a threshold for emotions that we feel. For me, when my anger is between a 4 and a 7, I'm cool. I can still be nice to people. I can still, get my job done. I can still go to work. I can still function okay. But for me, when my anger gets to an 8, what kind of mother do I turn into? I turn into the mother that calls home to say, hey, did you clean your room? You did clean your room. Well, did you wash the dishes? Did you vacuum? Did you clean the bathroom? Did you clean out the litter box? Right? I'm looking for something to give me a reason to go off, right? Because I have this buildup of emotions. So let me back up. So when we think about trauma is, and Erica, yes, when we think about drugs, so many women, and I'll come back, so many women, when we think about childhood trauma has preceded their drug use. my inability to cope with death of a parent. That's also one of the ACEs. And so it gives me a way out. It gives me a way not to feel. And so when we think about trauma, you all can't see, but I'm pointing to my kidneys. So your kidneys sit right above your hips, right near your hips. And above your kidneys sit your adrenal glands. And so your adrenal glands are responsible for the production of cortisol. So cortisol is known as our stress hormone. When I feel anxious, that causes a release. So anxiety, so trauma is what we consider an anxiety disorder, or PTSD is an anxiety disorder. And so when I experience anxiety, anxiety is an emotion that makes me want to move, right? No one, I feel so anxious, I think I'm going to go to sleep for 3 hours. And so when we think about that, one of the things that trauma does, it triggers, and many of you know, that fight or flight system. So I'm either going to run away from this thing, I'm going to stay and fight it. When we think about children, trauma triggers a third part called freeze. So I can't fight you. I can't run from you. I have to freeze and take it, right? The death of a parent. I can't run from that. Can't, fight it. I have to freeze and take it. So what happens to this cortisol? So this cortisol literally starts attacking different organs in our body, which is why for so many of us, when we feel stress, then I get sick, right? I've been stressed out all week. All of a sudden I get a migraine. I've been stressed out all week. All of a sudden I come down with a cold, or I'm already sick and I add stress to that and I stay sick for longer, right? And so what we're seeing with the impact of childhood trauma is literally disruption in the way that our bodies handle stress. We'll do a session on epigenetics where it literally becomes a part of our DNA over time. And, if I'm a parent and I'm anxious, or if I'm a parent and I'm depressed, I'm parenting out of that lens as well. Or if I'm in a relationship and I'm anxious, and I'm in a relationship and I'm depressed, I'm relating to my partner, my friends, my family out of that lens as well. And so when we think about this window of tolerance, what happens is that when we think about this bell curve that our emotions go on, once I get here, all bets are off, right? So these things are my trigger points. And we all have them. We all have trauma tolerances for people, places, and things in our life, all the nouns. We all have a trauma tolerance. So for me, maybe my children woke up late for school and maybe no one washed their face and brushed their teeth or got their clothes together the night before. Maybe there was traffic, maybe there was a report I had to do or a phone call I had to take and I didn't really want to take it. And so now I come home and someone has done something small. Someone left a toy out. Well, everybody has to die because someone has left this toy out, right? And when we think about it, we can laugh, but that isn't really the reason why I'm upset. What has happened is that I've built up trigger points, or what we call trauma tolerance, for all of these different events. So when we look at this from a childhood level, let's say at the age of 2, this happened to me, right? And then maybe at the age of 4, something else happened. And then at 8, I witnessed community violence. And then at 12, I witnessed something else. So now I'm 17 and I'm just at this point. So now I'm at a place where I'm hyper aroused. Anything is going to just set me off, right? I'm in a rage, I'm in a panic, I'm angry all the time. Or the inverse of that is that I begin to shut down. So now I don't feel anything. So now I'm just numb. Now I tell my kids, I don't care what you all do, just leave me alone. And so when we understand that, one of the things that we see is that I've learned to put my emotions either at this place of hyper arousal. So I'm always upset, I'm always doing something, or hypo arousal. And when we do that, one of the things that happens is that I'm walking around unable to feel, unable to connect. And Kathy, you bring up a great point. I think trauma tolerance leads to anxiety, definitely. So trauma tolerance, we break this down. We all have a trauma tolerance for different things, meaning that if I'm in a certain situation, there is so much of it that I can handle, or so much of it that I'll take before I start to seek assistance, before I admit that something is wrong, right? There's so much of it that I can take. And so with trauma tolerance, I remember working with women who had addiction histories. And one of the things, and so since Erica, you and Christina both brought up addiction, one of the things that addiction does is that it comes first before every relationship. It precedes parent-child relationships. Literally, it targets that amygdala, right? It targets that limbic system. So, My primary relationship is with the drug of choice before anybody else biologically. And so what happens? That means I'm neglecting myself. I'm not participating in self-care. I'm not going to my doctor. I'm not taking my children to the doctor. I am, neglecting my physical health, my mental health, my spiritual health. And so what that does is that it creates a trauma tolerance, meaning that I have to be this sick before I go seek medical attention. I have to lose these many teeth. I have to experience this much violence in a relationship before I realize, hey, something is off. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, and I want to go back to Kathy's point, that that anxiety, that cortisol, that adrenaline is not being produced in my body. And so when I can't express it, or when I've built up that numbness to it, what happens is that from a physiological standpoint, my stress rates are off the hook, right? Which is why when we look at heart disease, when we look at hypertension, when we look at diabetes rates, when we look at asthma even being linked to trauma, to traumatic experiences, one of the things that we're seeing is that people have such high trauma tolerances for events going on or situations going on in their life that I'm not even recognizing that it's a problem, because what has also developed in addition to this trauma tolerance is, again, that trauma context where, while my environment caused that initial trauma, that trauma, me trying to survive that trauma, caused me to normalize it, right? So this is how it is. This is how it is for me. Or I'm trying to run from it from a physiological or psychological standpoint or emotional standpoint. And so it's going to cause me to seek out more traumatic experiences because my trauma tolerance is so high. And so when we think about, and I want to go to Christina's point, when we think about people who stay here, this numb part, I don't know how to feel. Well, why is that? One of the things that trauma teaches us, especially as children, is that emotions are not safe, right? One of the things that trauma teaches us is that emotions are not safe. And the reason for that is because sometimes trauma comes in resulting from me experiencing emotions. If any of you caught the dad segments or the dad series that we did, so many, I think all four of the dads that we had on talked about the only emotion that they are allowed to experience socially is anger, right? Well, what about, so there's 6 universal emotions, right? So that means that there are 5 emotions I am not allowed to experience. But what am I leaving out? I'm leaving out joy. I'm leaving out sadness. I'm leaving out shame. I'm leaving out curiosity, and I'm leaving out fear, right? I'm leaving out all 5 of these emotions, and I'm only holding on to anger. Well, the interesting thing about anger is that anger is what we consider to be a secondary emotion, meaning that I usually feel something first, and then it turns into anger. So for those of you watching, think about road rage. How many of us have ever experienced road rage? My initial feeling is fear. I'm scared you're going to hit my car, but then I have to follow you for 10 miles or 10 minutes to let you know, don't get too close to my car. Or, think about heartbreak. I'm crushed, I'm broken, but now I'm singing Jasmine Sullivan. I'm busting the windows out, I'm angry, right? And so when we think about anger is usually an emotion that is covering something else underneath the surface. But when we think about anger from a traumatic standpoint, anger may be something that I may not be allowed to feel. And so when we think about one of the things that we have to understand, especially from a social standpoint, is that anger and anxiety kind of run hand in hand, right? So a lot of times, if anger is first precipitated by fear, sadness, anxiety, that anxiety turns into anger. When I address that anger, I usually still have that anxiety left, right? I still have to move. I still have to move around. I still have to do something with it. Still that fear-based response. And so that brings into something else that we're going to talk about as well, called the urban ACEs. So the original ACEs looked at those 3 things, so abuse, neglect, and dysfunction. But urban ACEs also takes into account how witnessing violence, discrimination, neighborhood safety, being bullied, or even being in the foster care system adds, again, the trauma that people experience. So Kenny, when you were talking about what to do with unvented anger, one of the things that we talk about with anger is that anger goes on a spectrum from slight irritation to rage. And anger is one of the emotions, one of those 6 universal emotions where a lot of times it's been modeled for us how we should express it. So some families, I'm really good at saying, hey, you irritated me today, right? Or, hey, I didn't like the way you did that. Or I felt, we use our affective statements. I felt angry or irritated when you. But for many people, just growing up, anger was expressed when it got to this point, right? When I'm at a rage, when I'm yelling at everybody for never cleaning up their room or never, taking out the trash or never doing anything else. And so as a child, that anger may serve as a gap in my development, because if I experienced anger as a child in a way that is scary, which is why so many of us fear anger, and anger is actually higher up the emotional scale than depression, because anger is an emotion that makes us move. And Kathy, yes, ACE stands for adverse childhood experiences. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And I'll put the link in the comments. And so when we're thinking about it, one of the things that we want to acknowledge is that I can do something with this, right? So when we think about unvented anger, it can move me. All of our emotions, those 6 universal ones I named: joy, fear, sadness, shame, curiosity, and anger, all 6 have the potential to either motivate us or immobilize us. One of the things that I talk about often is that anger is on the same spectrum with joy. I have seen people self-sabotage when things are going well for them. My joy puts me right on this bell curve, right? Because I'm not used to experiencing happiness. So when I get to this point, wow, this went well. Paid this bill on time, and this person said they love me, and I love them too. And I had some really good food, and this great thing happened. Guess what? I'm calling out from work for the next 4 days. I don't know. It's too much, right? The interesting thing about excitement and anxiety is that your brain can't tell the difference between the two. So I just won $10,000. I'm running around, I'm screaming, I'm doing all of this, right? Those are the same reactions I would be doing if I was scared or if I was anxious. I'm running around, I'm screaming. What the only difference is our thoughts, how we've internalized it. And so one of the biggest parts of the healing process when we talk about recovering from childhood trauma, or even adult trauma, but childhood trauma specifically, is acknowledging that I feel this way, right? Is acknowledging that I am angry. That's one of the biggest gifts that we can give ourselves, because again, when we think about trauma is the biggest boundary violator, meaning that it takes away my power, right? So I feel a certain way. I've been taught that I'm not allowed, or I'm not supposed to feel, or I'm not, entitled to feel, or only one person in this relationship is allowed to feel. How many of us have ever had a relationship with someone, again, romantic, platonic, family, friends, where they're the only ones allowed to feel, right? Happiness, sadness, anger, joy, curiosity, any of that. They're the only ones that are allowed to feel a certain way. And so part of our recovery process, or our healing process, is the first acknowledgement that I feel this way, and that it's okay to feel this way. And so when we get into these, I'm bringing back this trauma triangle, guys. I don't know if you're raising a hand or you give me a high five, but if you have a question, put it in the comments. And if you have a high five, I'm high fiving you back. So I'm gonna bring this up. When we think about this, adverse childhood experiences, Amy, and I'll put yours in here too, adverse childhood experiences, those of us who have lived through extreme violence, right? So when you live through violence, interesting thing, and so I'll bring in classic examples: PTSD, soldiers, right? And the reason I'm going to bring in soldiers, I'm going to connect it to Baltimore, is that studies have found that children in Baltimore, children in a lot of cities where there is marginalization, disenfranchisement, trauma, systemic trauma, and community trauma, right? So system trauma and community trauma live in violence that we would see in war-torn countries. We actually had people from the military come to hospitals to learn about how to operate on, victims of gunshot wounds. And so when you live in violence, one of the things that happens is that your bell curve a lot of times is here, right? I externalize that violence. So what we call that is hyper arousal. I externalize it. I am angry, right? Because, and why is that? Everything is a defense mechanism. Everything is a survival skill. So in a lot of our families, in a lot of our communities, we have to acknowledge that anger is safer to express than fear. And we have to start unpacking why that is, right? It's safer for me to say that I am angry, or it's safer for me to walk around with this facade of anger than to say I'm scared to walk from this house to this house, or to go from this room to this room. And so I'm either going to externalize it or I internalize it. And the thing that I want to point out is that a lot of times with those of us who internalize versus those of us who externalize, is that a lot of times you tend to fly under the radar. So when I'm witnessing extreme violence, either I have to put myself out on the front lines, or I want to disappear so that the survival thought is that it will pass me over. And so when we understand that, one of the things that we want to do is acknowledge part is that I should not be exposed to this, right? This is too much for my brain to normalize. And I'll tie this into your comment too, Christine, about helping children who show signs of PTSD. When I'm talking about showing signs of PTSD, one of the biggest things, and this will be in my takeaway points, is creating some sense of safety. And one of the questions that I have worked with survivors of trauma, and also more so providers who provide therapeutic services or respite care or foster care for children who have experienced trauma too, is what does safety look like and feel like? Because a lot of times we will come in, whether I'm a well-intentioned parent, whether I'm the well-intentioned wife, husband, spouse, friend, and I will get caught up in, I use this term a lot, in that trauma triangle. I'll reference that term a lot, where I come in and rescue you, right? So I'm going to create safety for you. Look at this. I've cleaned the whole house. I've created this soft environment. I've created, blue lights and yellow lights and soft dim lighting, and violins are playing. And I'm scared to death, right? Because I have normalized violence. And so one of the most powerful questions that we can give to people who have survived extreme violence is, what does safety now look like and feel like for you? Because the moment that I bring that in, looking like and feeling like, I'm activating 2 of the 5 senses. When I'm activating 2 of those 5 senses, I'm automatically bringing back that brain-body connection. When we have extreme violence, one of the things that extreme violence does immediately is disrupt that brain-body connection, right? I am straight going off of this amygdala, that system 1 brain, that final brain, prehistoric brain, right? I'm immediately going off of that. My only instinct is to survive. It's not about creating relationships. It's to get from here to there. And so when I'm able to do that, is that when I'm able to say, what does safety look like and feel like, what I'm actually doing is bringing up in a safe way that disconnect. And I want people to, or that discrepancy rather. I want people to say, okay, well, maybe this isn't it. And, sometimes we'll have people say, I don't know what safety looks like and feels like. Well, this is where we get into resources. So I'm going to jump ahead and go back. Well, what color would safety look like for you, right? We go as abstract. We bring in art. People bring in art therapy. What color would safety look like for you? What color would safety be, right? Where would you want to feel it in your body, right? Where would you want safety to feel in your body? Because one of the things too that a lot of times is overlooked too is that, especially for children hold trauma in their body, right? So, butterflies in my stomach. I get this pit in my stomach. My chest starts to hurt. Children will verbalize that. I don't know. It's just something about them. It didn't sit right. Well, where didn't it sit right? I want to target that area. And then I want to ask you, well, what would safety look like in that area? How would that area feel if you were calm, right? And so when we think about this too, we're able to start to bring back that brain-body connection, and also, more importantly, give ownership back to the person who has survived, that they then can create, and they then are the number 1 person in their recovery process. It's not me as your provider, whether I'm your therapist, educator, teacher, even your parent. I want to give that onus back to you, and it takes me out of having to be your rescuer, because one of the biggest thing that we want to take away from this too is that people are survivors. So when we think about trauma work, we don't call people victims. I don't. I believe that you are a survivor. You have survived, or you are surviving whatever has happened to you. And so when you have survived that, we get into a strength-based framework. So trauma-informed care is what? So it adheres to SAMHSA's 6 principles of trauma-informed care. SAMHSA, I'll put them on their Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, SAMHSA's 6 principles of trauma-informed care. What is the first one? Safety, exactly. What does safety look like and feel like to you? Trustworthiness and transparency. I want to build trust. And I want to be transparent. So everything I'm doing, I'm giving you ownership. So I'm doing an ACEs group with mothers who are in recovery. Now, before they do the group, I want to be upfront and honest about what I'm asking them to do, because part of our defense is to either repress. So I don't even necessarily remember everything that has happened to me. And so I don't want to cause you to have your floodgates open, and I haven't given you those skills, because again, I'm causing you to have these floodgates open to address these gaps. However, these gaps can only close if I've given you skills, or if you've learned new skills. If you have not learned new skills, you'll keep repeating that cycle. And so me having you relive your trauma may be actually detrimental if I haven't provided you with any resources or options on how to close those gaps. And so when we think about that too, one of the things that we talk about with that strengths-based framework is safety for people, right? Who are people that make you feel safe? What do they bring to the table? Who are natural supports? What type of close relationships do you have? Harvard University released a study, and it talked about the number of people or adults that children need in their lives in order to recover, right? So the number of people that you need in your life, the number of close relationships where safety is the number one. I feel safe talking to you. I feel safe expressing my feelings around you. I feel safe being around you. Physical safety, excuse me, emotional safety. And so when I'm able to do that, I'm able to have these close relationships. I'm able to focus on strengths in my recovery process and my healing. And then the last thing is that I'm able to incorporate mindfulness. Hold on, guys, I'm about to cough. And so when I'm able to incorporate mindfulness, that means that I'm in the present moment. Trauma, as we get ready to wrap up, trauma causes us to be between two places. And Kathy, you touched on one, anxiety. Trauma causes us to be between, a lot of times, depression and anxiety. And so when we think about depression and anxiety, depression is past tense thinking. So depression is, this did happen, this should have happened, this didn't happen, how come this didn't happen? And anxiety thinking is our futuristic thinking, right? So what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And so people actually get into cyclical thoughts. And so I am stuck between what hasn't happened and what I think is going to happen. And where I'm missing the entire mark is I'm not able to be in the present moment, right? So I'm stuck between what didn't happen to me and what I fear is going to happen to me. And Damien, this also goes back to your point about people who have experienced violence, because in order to survive, I have to think a day ahead, days ahead, weeks ahead. And so what happens when I am stuck between these two places? Well, I get here, disease, disability, and social problems. If I'm stuck between anxiety and depression, how am I relating to people? Right? You do one thing to me, you're triggering me back to something that happened to when I was, so I knew you were going to do that. I knew I couldn't trust you. I knew I couldn't do this. I knew and so I'm experiencing all these social problems. And so I'm missing out on being here, which is the present moment. The present moment is the only moment where our healing can occur. Present moment, and I am a firm believer in that. The present moment is the only moment where our healing can occur. So how do I get to the present moment? How do I get to a place where at one point, and we want to acknowledge that the present moment was not a safe space for me, right? The present moment was not a safe place to be. The first thing that we do, again, I'm going back to that safety. Safety trumps everything in healing. Is it safe for me to be in this present moment now, right? Is this person safe? Is this relationship safe? Is this building safe, right? And so if I can say yes, then what things can I appreciate about this present moment, right? Can I appreciate how I feel? There's a wonderful meditation that we do on the five senses. What is my favorite sight? How does it make me feel? Favorite sound, favorite smell, favorite taste, favorite touch. How do those things make me feel in the present moment? And for those of you who, and I gave this resource to resource parents too, or you can do it as an adult as well, making a shoebox with something that it represents each of those five senses and putting them in that shoebox. Who's my favorite person to look at? What's my favorite scene to see? People think about beaches. Or what's my favorite sound to hear? What's my favorite smell? And when I notice that I'm experiencing triggers, I open that box and I'm able to bring myself back into the present moment. One of the things that I often tell people too is that oftentimes we wait until we get to that hyper arousal, or we wait until we're numb. So I want you all to think, so I'm at that hyper arousal place, or I'm numb, and someone says, hey, Tara, you should, calm down. Do I say, I'm so glad you told me to calm down. I've been waiting for somebody to tell me that all day. No, I'm fussing at you now, right? A lot of times we wait until it is too late to try to get ourselves to calm down. I literally want to create a routine for myself. And this is important too, because when we think about trauma creates organized chaos, and also trauma gets us going without a routine. So especially if I live in a community where violence is present, I expect trauma to occur. And so part of, when we think about this, part of our healing work is from the moment I wake up, how can I work on my healing process, right? My healing is a lifelong process. I saw that someone's comment at the very beginning said that, childhood trauma lasts forever. Well, guess what else lasts forever? Your healing, right? If childhood trauma can last forever, our healing can be forever, and it can be beautiful. And so what things make me feel safe? The first thing I want to do when I wake up, what is the first thing I want to hear? What is the first thing I want to listen to? Who is the first person I want to call, right? I literally want to have those things that keep me in the present moment. And then those moments where, something triggers me. I want to be able to remind myself I am safe. There's a wonderful, for any of you who are practitioners, any of you who just want the workbook, is a wonderful workbook called Seeking Safety by Lisa Najavitz, where she talks about working with survivors of trauma and addiction and PTSD. And she does a lot of something called grounding. So if I can't do meditation, so I do a lot of mindful meditation, but sometimes meditation is too much. So we do grounding, right? So grounding is literally grab onto the side of my chair, and I want to feel the physical presence or being of something. I grip onto my chair. I push my feet flat into the floor. I take the number 100 and I subtract 7, and then I add 12. I'm doing things to keep my mind in the present moment. I'm riding the bus. The bus may be traumatic for me. What can I do? I can count the number of stop signs. I can count the number of houses that I see. I'm doing something to get ahead of the anxiety. And so what happens is that we literally change the way that our anxiety functions. So anxiety causes us to be reactive. If I'm ahead of it, I can start to become proactive instead of reactive, right? And so I'm not scared of that anxiety. I'm not angry about it. I know that this is here, and I know that these are things that I can do to bring me into the present moment, because every time I'm in the present moment, guess where I'm not? I'm not between depression and I'm not between anxiety, right? I'm here. And so this is where I want to stay. This is where I want to stay. I want to stay with people who keep me here, which is why, and I just have to say this, when we build up when we look at our society has built up a trauma tolerance, right? When we look at images being shown on social media freely, when we look at documentaries that are being, played, there are certain TV shows, there are certain documentaries, there are certain videos that I will never see because I work with survivors of trauma. And so that means that I have a high trauma tolerance. And so people will watch these things, or I'll have a conversation with someone that I know is a trigger for me. And I'll get off the phone and I'm like, oh my gosh, why am I up here? Part of our work in recognizing or bringing back or narrowing our trauma tolerance is to not expose ourselves to certain situations that we know are going to be triggering for us. And so when we understand that, I'm able to, again, focus on, so these are my 3 takeaways as we get ready to wrap up. I'm able to focus on my strengths, right? So if I feel stuck, and because again, trauma a lot of times brings depression, that shame that comes with that unnecessarily. And so asking myself, how have I managed to survive? Right? That automatically brings my strengths. How have I managed to survive this? What have I done well? Who are people that I can rely on? And so when we think about that too, bringing our strengths into our healing process, I've been able to manage this. How have I been able to set? I've been able to set boundaries. What do those boundaries look like for me? What do boundaries look like? Trauma is a boundary violator. So part of our healing is relearning boundaries, understanding, okay, you know what? This conversation didn't make me feel good. What would make me feel safer the next time? So focusing on our strengths and our recovery story, not going back or not entertaining conversations or relationships where I'm asked to retell my trauma story if I have not healed from it. You know, so much of social media asks us to relive trauma, or so many conversations, right? So tell me what happened. So tell me what happened again. So why, if this is not for my recovery process, I have the right to set the boundary and say, no, I don't want to talk about it. I want to see myself outside of that trauma, right? I want to create a new identity for myself. I don't want my trauma to give me my identity. I want to create an identity for myself. And so when we think about that too, so number 1, focus on our strengths and our recovery. 2, identify safe relationships. Who are people, places, and things that make me feel safe? I'm taking that from Sananda, but I talk about it too. So we're sharing that one, Sananda Edwards. I'm taking, who are people, places, and things that make me feel safe, right? Those are my relationships I want to cultivate. And then the 3rd takeaway point is, how do I incorporate mindfulness? So how do I incorporate meditation? Can't do meditation. Easy thing. How do I incorporate breathing? If I don't know how to start with breathing, literally you can do a square. I breathe in, out, right? We call it square breathing. I'm breathing in, out. There's a wonderful clip I use on YouTube called triangle breathing. You breathe in as the shape expands and you breathe out, because one of the things that trauma does when it triggers our anxiety, it literally shortens the amount of oxygen that's flowing to our brain, to our organs. And so we want to make sure that we're breathing. Mindful communication, I feel statements, I feel a certain way. I want to acknowledge how I feel in this moment before I respond, giving ourselves, and Erica, I'm going back to your point, the permission to set boundaries. Before I give you an answer, let me check in with myself and see how I feel, right? Let me acknowledge this pit in my stomach. Let me acknowledge that my heart is racing. Setting those boundaries, that's a part of mindfulness. Mindful movement, being able to express ourselves freely. And then 2, when we think about incorporating mindfulness as well, from the moment I wake up, acknowledging, how do I feel today? How do I want to feel today? And what things do I need to put in place to get there? What things do I need to focus on? And I focus on anything that brings gratitude in, because gratitude is one of the biggest ways to get into the present moment, right? Gratitude is one of the biggest ways to get into the present moment, and allowing ourselves to feel that. So we are at time. I went over, but it was a great conversation. I was reading your comments. Thank you so much, Shima. But we are going to finish up this conversation, but we're actually going to flip it. So, I wrote a post a few days ago that said, if trauma and dysfunction can be passed down from generations, so can our healing. And so we are going to focus on generational healing next Tuesday for Dr. Tara Tuesdays. How do we incorporate generational healing? Because so much of our trauma is passed down lineage, right? And again, we'll get into epigenetics, literally in our DNA and our behaviors. And so understanding, how do we start to change that narrative for ourselves and for our loved ones and for our families. So I want to, as always, thank you all so much for tuning in tonight, for giving me an hour of your time. We went over. Thank you, Erica, for saying we don't care about the time. I appreciate you all so much. Please join me next Tuesday, 16th, Dr. Tara Tuesdays. We are going to be talking about generational healing, creating our own healing stories, and passing that legacy down. Legacy. As always, Let's heal together. Thank you all so much. Peace.